Hi, I'm Tom, and this is Box Office Bombs, where we talk about movies that were absolute duds. But there is a catch. We won't be talking about the famous box office bombs, but the real lost ones that are forgotten in their time and ours. For today's video, we'll be talking about Ray Liotta's No Escape, 1994. Coming at a $20 million production, which most action movies today wish they could achieve, and they filmed this movie in a real world location. This movie was a box office bomb, grossing a very sad $20 million globally. This is the type of movie that people remember fondly, watching it 20 years ago randomly on the USA Network at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, why was this movie a box office bomb? We had some big names who were coming off major releases within the last few years, like Ray Liotta, Lance Henriksen, Stuart Wilson, Kevin Dillon, Kevin J. O'Connor, Michael Lerner, Ernie Hudson, yada yada. Solid cast of men who were near the higher end of their career, coming off movies like Goodfellas, Aliens, Platoon, Ghostbusters, Lethal Weapon 3, and etc. and etc. But they didn't move the needle. Well, maybe it was because the movie didn't have a big name producer. It had Gale Anne Hurd, whose accomplishments were Terminator, Aliens, The Abyss, and Tremors up to that point. She had so much success that they slapped it on the poster. Still, nothing. Well, it had to be something, right? Well, today, let's look at our usual suspects when it comes to struggling movies: story, economy, director, drama, and distribution. Let's start with the weakest argument to point our finger at: drama. There was very little drama that was or has been talked about when making this movie. The biggest gripe that people have had was that it rained constantly while filming on the Gold Coast and on location in the far north Queensland, Australia. But the director, cast, and crew have all stated that they were greatly impressed with everyone's fortitude to power through the grit and grime and finish this movie, even when terrifyingly large bugs and reptilians lived within spitting distance of their tents, who occasionally would enter their camps. But outside of that, no one has brought up X or Y or complained about Z. Seems like it was a very enjoyable movie to make. Point two, the director for this film is Martin Campbell. The drama about him and this film is that he has said in an interview with The Movies That Made Me that he turned this movie down 3 times and finally agreed to do it so he could buy a house.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like you got a bunch of them in No Escape, right?
No, No Escape. Yeah, 90, was that 94, 93?
It's 1994, yeah.
Yeah, that was a film that I turned down 3 times. Then, to be absolutely honest, I needed the money. I was buying a house.
And he said that with a chuckle. That kind of attitude can be translated into a film: poor performances by the actors, boring stunts, sloppy editing, and or lackluster storytelling because, you don't demand rewrites of the script. And at the same time, this was Campbell's first action movie, so naiveness to action could help us put more blame at his feet. I mean, at this time in his career, he was mainly known for his comedies and legal dramas like Eskimo Nell, Defenseless, and his BAFTA award-winning TV series Edge of Darkness. Why then was he hired to do action? I don't know. There's no definitive proof of why they chose him out of the thousands of other directors. But some good points would be his experience in dark and gritty movies, his ability to shoot intense short action bursts, which he does have some experience with action, but just not a full-blown movie, and his experience with working with up-and-coming to veteran actors. But the most important reason was he was cheap. He was a director that would eventually, and at the time was, catching the eye of major studios. So why not be the first people to lock him up in a super low contract? If it all worked out, you would have a blockbuster movie on a backyard budget. Alas, though. But this movie actually did help jumpstart his action movie making career and landed him one of his earliest defining jobs. From there, our director would make the 2 Mask of Zorro movies, as well as returning to the Bond franchise for Casino Royale, considered one of the best Bond movies that shifted Bond away from his more absurd type villains and premises, before returning right back to it. So we can kind of put some blame at his feet for not being overly enthusiastic when first signing on to this job, but he in return has devoted his life to a career of action films, meaning that No Escape had a huge influence over him, far greater than I believed. And sure, since that one major choking incident in 2011, he hasn't been the same, but he is still making pretty decent B-grade action movies. On to point 3, what about the 1994 box office or the economy? Well, to break both of those points, we had movies like Lion King, Forrest Gump, The Mask, and Flintstones become huge box office hits, which went hand in hand with the economy doing well in 1994, with interest rates at a 25-year low, buying and spending power was higher, GDP was climbing, so you can't blame the economy. Now, before I continue, I have to mention after looking over some movies and the pages I've been using for information, this information going forward is all based on the Box Office Mojo's 1994 list of domestic and worldwide box office. So movies like 1996 Independence Day's Wikipedia page says it made 817 million worldwide, but Mojo says it made 306 million stateside and total as well. Sorry if this can feel a little confusing and inaccurate to you, but I can only go based on what is at hand. So, 1994 was not a weak year for film, but it was for the first 4 months when this movie was released, which had nothing to do with the economy. Only 4 movies released in early 1994 crossed the $40 million, and one of those was a direct competitor with No Escape, not by genre, but by date. The first 2 movies to cross the 40 million had built-in audiences and were coming off successful prequels. Those were Naked Gun, 33 1/3, The Final Insult, and D2, The Mighty Ducks. The third movie was an original concept starring Jim Carrey as Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. The fourth movie to cross 40 million was also an original film with no fans and had to gain the box office just like No Escape, and that was 4 Weddings and a Funeral. Released in March of 1994, it didn't get a full release until the end of April, putting it directly in competition with No Escape. At the same time, with the rise of the movie's release, Hugh Grant was becoming a sex symbol, and Elizabeth Hurley, who wasn't in the movie, was helping spread awareness for it with her dress picture. By the time No Escape's first 2 weeks in theaters was happening, it was fighting with 4 Weddings and a Funeral for the top spot, with $5 million opening and a $4.5 million second week, which was on par with 4 Weddings and a Funeral. The only issue was, 4 Weddings and a Funeral was doing the same box office, holding the top spot with 700 less theaters in its 7th week. By week 3 and 4, Beverly Hills Cops 3, The Crow, and Maverick had shoved No Escape to the 7th and then the 9th highest grossing movie. And by then, the studio and theaters said enough, and they had their production value back, and the Flintstones opened, and there was no chance for anything else. Another reason for the weak box office at the beginning of 1994, which may or may not have really affected No Escape. I mean, word of mouth really affected it, but it did affect every major and minor studio, and that was the Holdovers from 1993. When going through the 10 best performing movies box office wise in January of 1994, 2 of them weren't released in December of 1993. 8th place, The Air Up There, starring Kevin Bacon, which would go on to become a box office bomb, was released in January. And the first place, Mrs. Doubtfire, raked in $61 million in its 3rd month, having been released in November of 93. In fact, expanding our scope and looking at the top 20 best performing movies of 1994 January, 4 movies were released in January and the rest were holdovers. Cool Runnings made nearly $8 million in January after being released October 1st of the previous year. Even Jurassic Park, a movie released in June of 1993, still made $3.5 million in January of 94. But I guess that's why it's called
Fuck you, it's January!
By February, most of the movies in the top 10 were released in February, meaning that most of the January movies were crushed by the holdovers. And the worst thing is that many of the February movies would go on to be box office bombs, outside of maybe Blank Check and Ace Ventura, the number 1 movie at the box office in February. Come March, same story. March had more March releases covering the top 10, but were still being beaten by Holdovers from 93. The number one spot, though, was being held by a movie released in March of 94, Naked Gun 33 and a Third, a movie with a built-in audience. But other movies like Guarding Tess and Greedy, which were in the top 10, would go on to become box office bombs, losing out on profitability to Mrs. Doubtfire's $12 million haul and Schindler's List holding the number 2 spot for $24 million. By April, the box office was almost entirely March and April releases, with only Schindler's List still holding a spot in the top 10. But by then, the damage was done. The Holdovers had dominated the box office, breaking the flow of movies' potential successes. And with that, many people began to spread gossip about the movies not being good in theaters, and with more people inclined to either wait and see what movie comes out or just went to see the Holdovers, this trend wouldn't be broken until May, when all the Holdovers were finally gone and a big blockbuster family film broke the box office curse that plagued them for 4 months. And with that, we have identified a major crux to the failure of No Escape. But are there other things that may have harmed this movie, such as distribution and plot? Well, distributed by Savoy Pictures, and no, you probably haven't heard of them, starting up in 1992 and lasting for a whopping 5 years, Savoy Pictures had one of the worst draw of the hands I have ever read about. Producing and distributing over 25 films and over 5 years, 4 turned a profit. Some costing Savoy $20 million or more in profitability, with most of their average net loss being between $7 to $12 million. After a few years of trying to make it as a big film studio and just constantly striking the wall with their head, Savoy Pictures pivoted over to TV holding stations before capitulating their business over to Silver King Communication in 1995. The acquisition was finished for $210 million, the only real profit the company ever had. And within the next few years, the last of their film archive would be released. Silver King Communications, you may now know as the USA Broadcasting Company, or IAC if you want to talk about the guy who owns USA. And in the subsequent years, Savoy Pictures' catalog would swap hands after mergers and sales, like Venvidi and General Electric ownerships over NBC Universal, which is now owned by Comcast. But because of that, Savoy Pictures films are all over the place in terms of ownership. Universal and Focus Features owns the majority of the catalog. Warner Brothers owns anything distributed by New Line. Paramount owns anything released by Reicher Entertainment. Pathé owns No Escape. Tribeca owns A Bronx Tale. And producer Joel B. Michaels owns The Last of the Dogmen. But Savoy Pictures was bad, just very bad at being a distributor, creator, and advertiser. Movies like No Escape, which cost $20 million to make, anywhere between 10 to 20 to advertise, was no way profitable for a small studio that kept striking out. For Savoy Pictures, it was impossible for them to make a truly successful business on such a broken system. If they embraced the Miramax, New Line, or even Canon film system, which Savoy was competing against the former two, then they would have invested in cheap horror or action films and swarmed the market with schlocky stuff. New Line was the house that Freddie built. Even then, the company would have probably still bombed. Looking over what little information is available, they didn't have a strong relationship with theaters, which translates to higher percentage totals of the box office going to theaters instead of the studio. Usually they had fewer screens for most of their movies, which can contribute to the failure of a movie, but not in the same way as Four Weddings and a Funeral versus No Escape, since No Escape did have 1,700 theaters, which seemed to be the average back in the 90s. They had weak promotional capabilities. 1997, before their closure, they had a staff of 16 people, and I doubt during their heyday they staffed more than 50, maybe 100. And this all compounds and results in not being able to run a nationwide campaign or coordinate press tours or build relationships or handle TV, radio, etc. spots. So Savoy Pictures was underfunded, lacked distribution power, required more marketing, and when they needed to fix their problems, their boss decided to pivot over to buying TV stations, dooming them to be sold off within the year. And it should also be mentioned that the big trend pre-2000s, movies would release stateside months in advance of the global release, meaning everyone in the world knew your movie sucked, before they even released in their country. It should also be mentioned that Savoy didn't make this movie, only purchased it from Allied filmmakers, probably for about the production value, a little over the production value, who also sold the international distribution to Columbia TriStar, aka Sony Pictures of today, who had suffered less financial loss after seeing how badly No Escape bombed in the US. But if this movie was just sold to Columbia TriStar, it may, and I'm stressing that may, have turned a profit. Now, on to the final point. What about the plot? I mean, we can see that No Escape failed because of poor advertisement, weak marketing, poor distribution, and 1993 holdovers ruining early 1994. Surely there can't be more. Well, not to get bogged down in doing a full movie review, let's just highlight a few key problems with this movie that led reviewers giving it a 2 out of 4 stars or 6 out of 10 and steering moviegoers away. It should also be mentioned that this was written by Joel Gross and Michael Galen, two men whose writing credits end with this movie. Michael Galen's only film credit for writing is No Escape, and Joel Gross has a 1992 TV movie. And that's it. First off, number one, lack of character development. J.T. Robbins, Liotta's character, plays Mr. Action Man, who, doesn't have a character. Instead of being given a story where we see him haunted by people whose lives he's taken or renouncing to never harm another soul or something, we're not really given anything except for some PTSD moments with fire and an exposition dump near the end of the movie. His guilt trauma is never addressed or confronted. He doesn't grow or change, just simply does what he wants to do in order to get off the island, while somehow becoming one of the Insider's most trusted guys. Which is another thing. JT doesn't really have a relationship with the Insiders. Thus, he doesn't have a reason to fight for them or protect them, and they have no reason to trust that he would take their plans or information about what's happening to them and give them to the right people in order to bring the prison warden to justice. The same prison warden that they trap on the island at the end of the movie. But he's not the only person. The father, played by Lance Henriksen, is just Mr. Build Civilization, and doesn't make a ton of sense when you think about how he's running a prison sanctuary for a group of men that couldn't cut it in a level 5 or 6 prison. Everyone there is a hardened criminal with death underneath their belts, so how did he create a colony of psychopaths, build a civilization, which is something that makes them a criminal as their rejection of civilization and the laws that go with it, and domesticate them? I don't know, and it's not really explained, but I think it has something to do with women, which this movie doesn't have. Not even a token. If we were going to tinker it with a little bit, it would have been so much easier for them to turn the Insiders into like political dissidents, and that the few ex-Merrick men among their ranks are their protectors, like Casey, who we'll say inflates his crime in order to look tougher in front of them, which Liotta's character, eventually figures out the truth, and Ernie Hudson. This would have helped push the dystopia-like story by kind of turning the island into the world's dumping ground for everyone from, Democratic supporters to cannibals and psychopaths. Merrick is another example, is never given a story of why he hates the father, or why he's on the island, or why he's bad, other than we needed a villain. Now, we can excuse that a little bit because I love Mad Max, and I didn't need a lot of backstory to love those movies to have a great villain. Also, I kind of want to shoehorn Mad Max in there. The same person who did the outfits for Road Warrior also did this movie. But Merrick is supposed to be the leader of this wide range of different tribal prisoners, or at least the one calling the shots. And we see why he's calling the shots, because of the rocket launcher. Right? Not really. Seeing him give over the launcher to Robin without trying to have his men find him, or by going to the coast and looking for his body among the rocks, or trying to barter peace for the launcher and Robin's, the movie could have used the rocket and Robin's as a crux of what leads them to attacking the father. And we could have easily said that before Robin's, we could say the island had a steady status quo with the father supplying them liquor for peace, since we had to have this scene where Liotta drinks moonshine. Then Robbins ruins it by snagging the launcher, and Merrick has to push his men to attack the father in order to not look weak in front of them. the rocket launcher being missing is what leads to Merrick beheading these tribal leaders who try to question his authority. It just was a missed opportunity all around to develop Merrick and the story. Also, you could have had a scene where Merrick believes the rocket won't work because it never did for him. He was only using it for show, and you have him slowly make his way up the ramp before Robbins launches the rocket and destroys his men and blows up the Bury, destroying any ability of, the future status quo ever coming back. And those aren't the only ones who don't have a character or story. I mean, we have not Winston Zeddemore or not Benny, who they both give their names and are introduced, but they never have anything else outside of that. Or what about Merrick's helper guy number 1 that he beheads, or Merrick's helper guy number 2, who is revealed to be a spy for the father, which didn't make a ton of sense since he tried to kill the father with Merrick in the middle of the film. But I guess we can just kind of chalk that up to either bad writing or storytelling from the director. And they needed JT to escape the prison, and they inserted him as a spy. Also, he's not the only turncoat. This guy is also a turncoat working for the warden because the warden promised to take him off the island. And that's only in the movie because after killing Merrick, we didn't have a way for Liotta to escape the island. So we created this absurd plot point in order to progress to the ending where the warden gets his just dessert and everyone is going to trust JT to save them. Also, why would the warden save a convict just because he was his spy? If I was the warden, I would say, oh, well. But if we were to look at the spy a little closer, like, what's his story? I don't know. Wikipedia's only description of him is that he's a hypochondriac, which is understandable on an island without medicine. Now, storytelling is all about introducing things about our characters, either physically or psychologically, that influences behaviors that trigger outcomes. Examples, our character is a hypochondriac. He also wears a cross, and he's a little effeminate. With a little writing, we can have a wide range of what to do. Leaving him in the background only to shoehorn him in at the end of the movie as a secondary, third-rate villain is lazy, like how many of the characters in this are written. The show, though, has other issues. It's just not character development that also affects the whole flow of the movie. But there's other issues as well. Number 2, the plot is driven by convenience. Examples, Robbins is rescued by the insiders because the plot required him to be rescued by them in order to meet them. The insiders, don't really have any reason to save Robbins and are just compelled to. Same with sharing information and bringing him into their clique. Another one is the prison intervenes at the end of the movie because they needed to find a way to get the warden to the island, but they already introduced the helicopter coming to the island to drop off supplies for the outsiders, which they could have made into Robin's escape plan instead of the nonsense of the priest trader. But they needed a way for the warden to get his just desserts and for Liotta to escape. It's just, yeah. Number 3, I think. The ending is lackluster for a word. It leaves a bunch of open questions like what happened to the insiders? Is the prison system exposed? What happened to Robbins after he flies off into the sunset? Did Merrick's tribe collapse or become more brutal without their leader? Etc., etc. Number 3 or number 4, the prison system seems very weird in this if you think about it longer than 5 seconds. Is it for profit? And if so, how? The only thing I can think of is I suppose they lie about the island's use and simply make the island a black site where they drop prisoners off to die from exposure while collecting yearly checks from the government. But then how can you have a spy satellite orbiting the prison colonies without the government knowing? Another example is what put these people on this level 6, 7 island? Or is it just a random prison that the corporation owns? And sometimes they put hardened criminals there and other times shoplifters. Robin had to be sent to the island after breaking out of prison twice and threatening the warden. What about the others? Merrick and his men even get supplies airlifted to them. And Merrick owns a rocket launcher. So does Merrick work for the prison as like some hired murderer who goes around killing prisoners for him? And my last point about the island is the concept of the island is really expensive and doesn't seem like it works the way that the warden or whoever wrote this wants it to work. Why not surround the island with a 10 to 20 foot cement wall along the perimeter of the island, or sink a net to the bottom of the ocean floor and make sure that it climbs X feet high into the air as well, cordoning off the island? This would make sure that the cloaking material that they use for their ship, which washes in as debris, doesn't make it to the island. Also, if you want these prisoners to die, why send them to an island with fresh water, fish, birds, land animals, and plenty of crops? The original prison in the opening of the movie seems like where you would send your troublemakers. It's surrounded by a desert. The simplest way I can think of fixing this movie is to set it 100 years into the future, put it on an alien prison planet, and have the whole movie circle on the character not trying to escape, but trying to survive. You could also do, more of a deep dive into a dark dystopian future about prison for profit or about the silencing of free speech and so on. The easiest thing to do is just recreate Escape from New York.
Nobody draws until this hits the ground. You ready?
Oh yeah, they already did. But like I said, this isn't a movie review. I just wanted to highlight things that turned it into a box office bomb. So based on everything that we covered, No Escape had the perfect storm for failure. It had 1993 Holdovers that ruined the box office leading up to No Escape. It had a very weak marketing and a disjointed release window all over the world, most of them 6 months after its original release. The small failure-prone distributor, fairly new to action genre director, who, yes, did score GoldenEye because of this movie, and the story was shabby that led to reviews that harmed the movie's potential profitability. And this is all without mentioning the cast, who are not bad leads and rightly deserve to be leading men in any other movie. But Liotta doesn't exactly bring people in to see an action movie, but more of a drama, thriller, gangster film. He has a charm to him while playing an absolute psychopath. So he would have probably been a great villain for this movie, but as the lead, I don't know. Also, I didn't mention, because there's no proof, if Gale Anne Hurd had any influence on the movie. Producers can force rewrites and redirections if they're not satisfied with the dailies, or force a director to tell the story that the script says and strong-arm the director from making more logical choices story-wise. But there's no proof, so I can't cast suspicion. But outside of that, there you go. Everything that led to No Escape's 1994 box office bomb. I'm Tom, and you guys have a good one.